My name is Catherine, I'm 38 years old, and I work as a corporate attorney in Chicago. 3 months ago, at what was supposed to be my milestone 38th birthday celebration, my husband stood up in front of 150 guests and announced he was divorcing me. He thought he was humiliating me in the most spectacular way possible. What he didn't know was that every single person in that room was already on my side, armed with evidence, and ready to watch his entire world crumble. What I did in the following 60 seconds changed both our lives forever. Before I tell you exactly how this unfolded, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, because you're not going to believe where this story goes. Drop your location in the comments and let me know if you've ever dealt with someone who thought they were smarter than everyone else. Trust me, you'll want to follow along for what comes next. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand how perfect everything seemed before it all shattered. I met David Brennan on a Tuesday morning in September, 7 years ago. I was 31, working 12-hour days at Morrison & Blackwell, one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms. I'd stopped for my usual morning coffee at the cafe on Michigan Avenue, the one with the blue awning and those impossibly comfortable leather chairs by the window. I was reviewing a brief on my laptop, completely absorbed in the legal minutiae of a corporate merger case, when someone knocked over my coffee. The hot liquid spread across the marble table, and I jumped back just in time to save my laptop. A man's voice, deep and genuinely apologetic, said those words that would change my life. He was standing there in an expensive charcoal suit, holding napkins, looking absolutely mortified. David was 35 then, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples, green eyes that seemed to sparkle with intelligence, and a smile that made my heart skip unexpectedly. He insisted on buying me another coffee, then breakfast. Then somehow we were talking for 2 hours about everything from philosophy to our favorite childhood movies. He told me he was a financial consultant, working with tech startups and venture capital firms. He made me laugh with stories about his disastrous attempts at cooking, his inability to keep houseplants alive, and his secret addiction to reality television shows. When he asked for my number, I gave it without hesitation. Looking back now, I can see how carefully that meet-cute was constructed. How perfectly he played the charming, slightly clumsy professional who'd just met the woman of his dreams. The courtship that followed was something out of a romantic movie. David pursued me with an intensity that felt intoxicating. He sent flowers to my office, not just roses but my favorite peonies, which he'd somehow discovered during our first conversation. He remembered everything I mentioned in passing. When I casually mentioned loving a particular Italian restaurant from my college days, he found the chef who'd since moved to a different establishment and arranged a private dinner where the chef prepared all my favorite dishes from memory. He showed up at my apartment on rainy evenings with my favorite takeout and classic films I'd mentioned wanting to watch. He integrated himself into my life with such natural ease that within 3 months, I couldn't imagine my days without him. He met my parents over Thanksgiving that first year, and my father, usually skeptical of the men I dated, pulled me aside and told me David seemed like one of the good ones. My mother adored him, especially after he spent an entire afternoon helping her organize her recipe collection and listening to stories about my grandmother. My best friend Sarah, who'd seen me through terrible relationships before, gave him her approval after he demonstrated genuine interest in her photography career and connected her with potential clients. Everyone loved David. He was attentive without being smothering, successful without being arrogant, handsome without being vain. 6 months into our relationship, we took a weekend trip to Napa Valley, and as we watched the sunset over the vineyards, he told me he'd never felt this way about anyone before. I believed every word. The proposal came on a perfectly crisp autumn evening 14 months after we met. David had arranged what he said was a simple dinner reservation at Alinea, one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants. I wore a navy blue dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and when we arrived, I was surprised to find the private dining room filled with candles and covered in photographs he'd secretly collected from our time together. Every meaningful moment documented, printed, and displayed like an art installation of our love story. There was the photo from our first real date at the Art Institute, both of us laughing at a modern sculpture neither of us understood. Pictures from the Michigan Lake House weekend, from the Christmas market, from the charity gala where I'd won a pro bono case that same evening. And in the center of it all, David got down on one knee with a vintage emerald ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Also, he said. He told me that I was the missing piece he'd been searching for his entire life, that he wanted to build a life together, have children, grow old watching sunsets from our porch. The ring fit perfectly. I said yes through tears of joy while a string quartet played our favorite song from a corner of the room. Later, I would discover that room hadn't been at Alinea at all, but at a restaurant his college friend owned, and every detail of that perfect proposal had been calculated for maximum emotional impact. Our wedding was everything I'd dreamed of, and never thought I'd actually have. We were married on a June afternoon at the Chicago Botanic Garden, surrounded by 200 guests and thousands of blooming flowers. I walked down the aisle in a Vera Wang gown while my father cried openly, and David waited at the altar looking like he might burst from happiness. We'd written our own vows, and when David promised to be my partner, my protector, and my best friend for the rest of our lives, I saw my future mother-in-law dab at her eyes with a handkerchief. The reception lasted until midnight, filled with dancing, laughter, and toasts from friends who spoke about how perfect we were for each other. My law school roommate gave a speech about how she'd never seen me so happy, how David had brought out a lighter, more joyful version of me. David's best man told stories about David's previous failed relationships, and how he'd always known David was waiting for the right woman. We honeymooned in the Greek islands for 2 weeks, staying in white-washed villas overlooking the Aegean Sea, eating fresh seafood and drinking wine while planning our future together. We talked about buying a house in Lincoln Park, about the 3 children we'd have, about growing old together. I thought I'd found forever. Little did I know, I'd actually found the world's most skilled actor. The first year of marriage felt like an extended honeymoon. We bought a beautiful brownstone in Lincoln Park with high ceilings, original hardwood floors, and a small garden in the back where I imagined our future children playing. David was supportive of my career, never complaining when I had to work late on important cases. He took over most of the cooking, since he'd secretly been taking lessons to surprise me. On weekends, we explored the city together, trying new restaurants, attending gallery openings, and hosting dinner parties where our combined friend groups merged into something that felt like family. He remembered important dates, surprised me with weekend getaways, and seemed genuinely interested in the details of my work. When I made junior partner at the firm 18 months into our marriage, David threw me a surprise celebration and gave a toast about how proud he was to be married to such an accomplished woman. We started trying for a baby that fall, and the joy of that shared goal brought us even closer, or so I believed. Every morning, David would kiss me goodbye and tell me he loved me. Every evening, he'd ask about my day with apparent genuine interest. Our life together looked perfect from every angle. If you'd asked me then whether I was happy, I would have said I was living my dream life. What I didn't know was that dreams can be manufactured, and perfection can be a carefully constructed illusion designed to maximize the impact of its eventual destruction. But then small things started to change, barely noticeable shifts that I dismissed as normal relationship evolution. David began staying late at the office more frequently, sometimes not coming home until after midnight. When I asked about it, he explained that he was working on a major deal with a Silicon Valley startup, that the time difference meant late night conference calls, that the project was temporary but crucial for his career advancement. It seemed reasonable. I was working long hours myself, often bringing case files home on weekends. But then I noticed he'd started keeping his phone face down on surfaces, something he'd never done before. When I mentioned it casually, he laughed and said he'd read an article about phone radiation and was trying to be more conscious about exposure. Again, it sounded plausible enough that I didn't press. He became increasingly interested in my schedule, asking detailed questions about when I'd be home, whether I had evening plans, if I'd be traveling for work. At the time, I thought he was being attentive, trying to coordinate our busy lives so we could spend quality time together. I even found it endearing that he wanted to know my whereabouts. Looking back now, I can see he was tracking my movements, ensuring he knew exactly when he had freedom to do whatever he was doing behind my back. The phone calls started around that time too. His phone would ring at odd hours, and he'd step into another room to take the call, speaking in hushed tones I couldn't quite hear through the walls. Once, at 2 a.m, I woke up to find him in the bathroom with the shower running, talking to someone in an intense whisper. When he came back to bed, and I asked who'd called so late, he said it was a client in Tokyo, that he'd run the shower to avoid waking me with the conversation. I accepted the explanation, because I wanted to believe him, because suspicion felt like a betrayal of the trust our marriage was built on. I told myself that marriage meant giving your partner the benefit of the doubt, that my legal training made me too skeptical, that not everything needed to be cross-examined like a witness on the stand. I rationalized every inconsistency, explained away every odd behavior, and convinced myself that I was being paranoid. My friends at the firm joked about how naive I was outside the courtroom, how I could spot a lying witness from 100 feet, but couldn't see obvious red flags in my own life. There were other strange behaviors that accumulated like drops filling a bucket. David began insisting on handling all our finances personally, saying I was too busy with my demanding caseload to worry about household bills and investments. At the time, I appreciated what seemed like him taking responsibility and lightening my load. He created a shared calendar for our schedules, but would frequently add or change appointments without telling me, then act confused when I didn't remember events I'd never agreed to attend. He started asking me to sign documents quickly, always when I was rushing out the door to court, or exhausted after a long day, saying they were just routine paperwork for our accountant or insurance updates. I'd scribble my signature, without reading carefully, trusting my husband to handle administrative details properly. Now I realize those moments were when he was getting me to sign blank forms he could fill in later, documents that gave him access to accounts and assets I didn't know existed. The manipulation was sophisticated precisely because it was gradual, each small request seeming reasonable in isolation, only revealing its true purpose when viewed as part of a larger pattern I was too close to see. Then came the credit card statement incident. I was organizing our financial documents for tax purposes when I noticed charges I didn't recognize. Expensive dinners at restaurants we'd never been to together. Hotel rooms in the city, despite us living 20 minutes away. Jewelry purchases from stores I'd never heard of, for amounts far exceeding anything David had ever spent on gifts for me. When I brought it up, David's explanation was smooth and immediate. The dinners were client meetings. The hotels were when he'd had too much to drink at networking events and didn't want to risk driving home. The jewelry was for his mother's upcoming birthday and his sister's anniversary. He seemed annoyed that I was questioning him, hurt that I didn't trust him to manage his own finances responsibly. He turned it around on me, asking if I was going to monitor every dollar he spent, whether I thought so little of his judgment. I felt guilty for bringing it up, apologized for seeming controlling, and dropped the subject entirely. Now I realize that was the first time he used a manipulation tactic that would become his signature move. Take my legitimate concern, reframe it as my failing, make me apologize for having completely reasonable questions. It worked perfectly because I was so invested in being a good wife, so determined not to be the suspicious, nagging spouse I'd seen in other failing marriages. Friends and family started noticing changes too, though they were hesitant to say anything directly to me. My mother mentioned over lunch that David had seemed distracted at our last family dinner, that he'd checked his phone constantly, and barely engaged in conversation with my father about the baseball season. My sister told me months later that she'd seen David at a downtown bar with a woman who definitely wasn't a client, based on how close they were sitting, but she'd convinced herself it must have been innocent, because David was such a good husband. Sarah, my best friend, tried to broach the subject delicately when we met for drinks one evening. She said she'd noticed David's Instagram had become more active, that he was posting stories and photos at times that didn't align with when he said he was in business meetings. When I checked, I saw what she meant. Photos posted from coffee shops during hours he'd claimed to be in back-to-back conference calls. Check-ins at restaurants in neighborhoods he had no business reason to visit, but when I looked at the actual content, it was all innocuous. Pictures of food, architectural details, sunset views. Nothing that proved anything suspicious. I told Sarah she was reading too much into social media activity, that she'd been hurt too many times, and was projecting her experiences onto my marriage. She backed off, but I could see the concern in her eyes. She knew something was wrong even if I refused to see it. Still, I remained hopeful. I convinced myself we were just going through a rough patch, that all marriages experienced phases of disconnection, that we'd work through it like mature adults. I suggested couples therapy, thinking maybe we needed help communicating better. David agreed enthusiastically, which I took as a good sign. We went to 3 sessions with a therapist in River North, but David always had an excuse for why. He couldn't make the 4th appointment, then the 5th. Then he stopped pretending to try to reschedule. I went alone for a while, and the therapist gently suggested that perhaps David wasn't as invested in repairing the marriage as I was. I defended him, explained his demanding work schedule, insisted he did care, but was just stressed. The therapist looked at me with something like pity, and said that sometimes we work harder to convince ourselves of something than we work to change the actual situation. Those words haunted me, but I still wasn't ready to face what they really meant. I wanted to believe in the marriage I thought I had, the partner I thought I'd chosen, the future I thought we were building together. Hope is a powerful drug, and I was completely addicted. Then came the first incident that I couldn't explain away. The moment that should have been my wake-up call, but that I still managed to rationalize. It was a Thursday night in March, about 3 years into our marriage. I came home early from work, because a deposition had been cancelled, walking into our house around 6 o'clock, instead of my usual 9. I heard voices coming from upstairs, from our bedroom. David's voice and a woman's laugh, light and familiar. My heart started pounding as I climbed the stairs, each step feeling like it took an hour. I pushed open our bedroom door to find David sitting on our bed fully clothed, and Jessica, his so-called business partner, sitting in the armchair by the window, also fully dressed. They both looked up, and for just a second, I saw panic flash across David's face, before his expression smoothed into casual surprise. He said he'd told me Jessica was coming over to review their pitch deck for a potential investor meeting the next morning. He said he'd texted me about it. When I checked my phone, there was indeed a message sent 3 hours earlier that I'd missed during back-to-back meetings. Jessica smiled at me and said something about how great it was to finally meet me properly, that David talked about me constantly. She left shortly after, and David asked why I seemed upset. He said I was being irrational, that I was imagining things, that he was allowed to have female colleagues, and I needed to deal with my insecurity. That word, insecurity, he wielded it like a weapon, and it landed exactly as he intended. I apologized for overreacting, felt embarrassed by my suspicion, and tried to push down the instinct that was screaming something was very wrong. The psychological manipulation intensified after that night. David began regularly commenting on my appearance in ways that seemed complimentary on the surface, but left me feeling inadequate. He'd say things like he noticed I'd gained a little weight, but it looked good on me, made me seem less intimidating. He'd suggest I might want to update my wardrobe because the fashion at my firm was so conservative and boring. He'd mention that I seemed stressed and tired all the time, that maybe I was working too hard, that other wives of successful men didn't feel the need to prove themselves constantly. Each comment was delivered with a smile, with apparent concern for my well-being, but the cumulative effect was devastating to my self-esteem. I started second, guessing everything about myself. Was I too focused on work? Too driven? Too independent? Was that why David seemed distant? I found myself trying harder to be the wife I thought he wanted. I started leaving work earlier, turning down high-profile cases, making sure dinner was ready when he got home on the rare nights he came home at a reasonable hour. But nothing I did seemed to make a difference. If anything, the more I tried, the more critical he became. The second major incident happened on our 4th anniversary. I'd planned a romantic dinner at home, taking the entire day off to prepare David's favorite meal, setting up candles throughout the house, buying expensive wine I'd been saving for a special occasion. David was supposed to be home by 7. 7 came and went. 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. He didn't answer my calls or respond to my texts. I sat at our beautifully set dining table, watching the candles burn down, the food going cold, feeling humiliation wash over me in waves. He finally walked in at 11:30 p.m. and I could smell perfume on him, something floral and expensive that wasn't my scent. When I asked where he'd been, he exploded. He shouted that he'd been at a mandatory client dinner, that I knew how demanding his job was, that I was being selfish and needy by expecting him to prioritize a meaningless anniversary over his career. He said I was turning into one of those clingy wives he'd always despised, that I needed to give him space to breathe. Then he stormed upstairs and locked himself in the guest room. I sat in our kitchen until 3 in the morning, crying and wondering how we'd gotten to this place. The next day, he apologized profusely, brought me flowers, and said he'd been under tremendous stress with a deal that was falling apart. He blamed his outburst on exhaustion and pressure. He said he loved me, that he'd make it up to me. I wanted so badly to believe him that I ignored every instinct telling me this was abuse, that his behavior was escalating, that I needed to protect myself. A third incident occurred several months later, during a work event I'd been excited about for weeks. My firm was hosting a gala for our biggest clients, and I'd been asked to give a presentation about our recent victories in complex litigation cases. It was a career milestone, an opportunity to shine in front of partners and potential clients who could shape my future at the firm. David had promised to attend, even bought a new suit for the occasion. The presentation went brilliantly, and I searched the ballroom for David's face in the crowd, wanting to share this moment of professional triumph with him. He never showed up. When I finally got through to him hours later, after the event had ended, and I'd made excuses to colleagues about his absence, he said he'd forgotten. Just completely forgotten. He'd been at a bar with Jessica and some other colleagues, lost track of time, and his phone had died. He didn't apologize for missing my important night. Instead, he got annoyed that I was making such a big deal about it, said I was being dramatic about what was just a work party. That my job wasn't the center of the universe. The hurt I felt went deeper than anger. It was the realization that the person who was supposed to be my biggest supporter couldn't be bothered to remember the events that mattered most to me. When I tried to explain how important the gala had been, he cut me off and said, maybe I cared more about impressing my colleagues than I cared about our marriage. He turned my pain into evidence of my failings, a tactic he'd perfected. The isolation began subtly but systematically. David started making comments about my friends, particularly Sarah. He'd say she seemed bitter about being single, that she was probably jealous of our marriage, that spending time with her always left me in a bad mood. He suggested that my parents were too involved in our lives, that we needed to establish better boundaries with them, that their constant check-ins felt intrusive. He complained that my work friends were boring, that our dinner parties with them were tedious, that I should make more effort to socialize with his colleagues and their wives instead. Gradually, I found myself seeing less of the people who knew me best, who might have recognized what was happening and intervened. When Sarah texted asking to meet for lunch, I'd make excuses. When my mother invited us for Sunday dinner, I'd decline on David's behalf, saying he was too tired. I stopped attending the monthly book club I'd been part of for 6 years. I pulled away from the women's networking group at my firm. Without consciously realizing it, I'd allowed David to build a wall between me and everyone who truly cared about my well-being. The only people left in my social circle were David's friends and colleagues. People who saw me through his lens, who believed his version of our marriage, who had no reason to question his narrative. Then came the worst moment, the incident that finally shattered my ability to deny reality. It was a Saturday morning in late October, about 5 months before my birthday party. I'd been fighting a terrible flu all week, barely able to get out of bed. David had been attentive at first, bringing me tea and medicine, checking on me between his various commitments. But on this particular morning, I woke up to hear him on the phone in his office, which was directly below our bedroom. The heating vent carried his voice clearly, and what I heard made my blood run cold despite my fever. He was talking to Jessica, and he wasn't discussing business. He was telling her how much he missed her, how difficult it was to pretend to care for his sick wife, how he couldn't wait until everything was finalized. He said the words that destroyed me completely. He told her that I was so pathetically grateful for any crumb of affection, that I'd never suspect anything, that I was making this almost too easy, that soon I'd serve my purpose, and he could move on to the life he actually wanted. I lay in bed shaking, unsure if what I'd heard was real or a fever dream. But the conversation continued, and there was no mistaking his words. He talked about timing, about assets, about making sure everything was set up correctly before the reveal. Then he laughed, actually laughed, and said something about how poetic it would be to do it at my birthday party, surrounded by everyone who thought we were the perfect couple. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt that gut-wrenching realization that your entire life has been a lie, please hit that like button and subscribe. The justice that comes next is something you won't want to miss. I spent the next 3 hours lying perfectly still, in that bed, my mind racing through every moment of our relationship with new understanding. The perfect meet, cute at the coffee shop, hadn't been an accident. The whirlwind romance wasn't about love. The carefully constructed proposal, the dream wedding, the supportive husband act during my career advancement, all of it had been a performance designed for a specific purpose. I thought about the credit card charges, the late nights, the phone calls, Jessica sitting in our bedroom, the anniversary he'd missed. Every red flag I'd ignored, every excuse I'd accepted, every time I'd apologized for my legitimate concerns. I saw it all clearly now, the manipulation tactics he'd used to isolate me, undermine my confidence, and position himself as the wronged party in whatever he was planning. But what was he planning exactly? What did he mean about me serving a purpose? What assets was he discussing? What needed to be finalized? The specific moment of full realization came that afternoon when David left to run errands. Despite feeling like death, I dragged myself out of bed and into his office. I'd never snooped through his things before, had always respected his privacy, because I'd expected the same in return. But that conversation had broken something fundamental in me, shattered whatever trust remained. I started with his desk drawers, finding nothing but ordinary office supplies and client files. Then I checked his laptop, but it was password protected with a code I didn't know. Finally, I opened the closet where he kept old files and storage boxes. Hidden behind a box of college textbooks, I found a leather folder I'd never seen before. Inside were documents that made my hands shake so badly I could barely read them. There was a prenuptial agreement I'd never signed, forged with my signature, designed to leave me with almost nothing in a divorce. There were financial statements showing David had been systematically moving our joint assets into hidden accounts. There were emails printed out between David and Jessica discussing their plan to take over my trust fund, which I'd inherited from my grandmother, but which David had convinced me to put in a joint account for estate planning purposes. There were photographs of David and Jessica together, clearly involved romantically, dating back 3 years, almost to the beginning of our marriage. But the worst discovery was a detailed timeline, written in David's handwriting, outlining his entire scheme. He'd targeted me specifically, because I was a successful attorney from a wealthy family, with a substantial trust fund. The coffee shop meeting had been orchestrated after he'd researched my routine through social media. Every romantic gesture during our courtship had been calculated to make me fall completely in love. The marriage had been about gaining legal access to my assets and my professional credibility. He'd been working for years to position himself to take everything while publicly humiliating me in a way that would destroy my reputation in Chicago's legal community. The timeline showed his original plan had been to announce the divorce at a firm holiday party. But he'd changed it to my birthday party, because the symbolism was too perfect to resist. He actually wrote that watching me be humiliated on what should be my happiest day would be the cherry on top of his victory. He outlined how he'd portray me as an unstable, jealous wife who'd driven him away with paranoia and controlling behavior, how he'd already planted seeds of that narrative with friends and colleagues, how he'd used my own efforts to save our marriage as evidence of my instability. The emotional devastation of that discovery was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I'd prosecuted complex fraud cases, defended victims of terrible crimes, thought I understood the depths of human deception. But this was different. This was personal in a way that reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until I couldn't breathe. The man I'd loved, the person I'd built my life around, the future father of the children I'd hoped to have, he'd never been real. Every kiss had been fake. Every I love you had been a lie. Every moment of intimacy had been him tolerating me while planning my destruction. I sat on the floor of his office, surrounded by evidence of his betrayal, and for the first time in my adult life, I had no idea what to do. My legal training seemed useless. My usual analytical thinking was overwhelmed by emotion. I wanted to confront him immediately, to throw the evidence in his face and demand answers. But some instinct held me back. Some small voice that said, I needed to be smarter than that. That night, still feverish but running on pure adrenaline, I made a decision that changed everything. I wasn't going to be David's victim. I wasn't going to let him humiliate me publicly and take everything I'd worked for. I was going to fight back, but I needed to do it carefully, strategically, the way I would approach a complex legal case. I started by photographing every single piece of evidence I'd found, uploading the images to a secure cloud account David didn't know existed. I carefully put everything back exactly as I'd found it, making sure nothing looked disturbed. Then I crawled back into bed and pretended to still be barely conscious when David came home. He brought me soup and medicine, stroked my hair, and told me I'd feel better soon. His touch made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to thank him, to act like the trusting wife he thought I was. Because I realized something crucial. David's entire plan relied on me being clueless until the moment of his big reveal. If he knew I'd discovered the truth, he'd accelerate his timeline or change tactics. My advantage was that he still thought he was in control. Over the next 3 weeks, I secretly gathered evidence with the thoroughness of a prosecutor bidding a case. I installed monitoring software on our shared computer that captured every keystroke David made. I placed a small recording device in his office that activated on voice detection. I hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent I'd worked with on a case years ago, to follow David and document his relationship with Jessica. I contacted a forensic accountant to trace all our financial transactions and identify every hidden account. I reached out to my own attorney, not someone from my firm, but an outside specialist in high-conflict divorces, and began building a legal strategy. Most importantly, I started carefully documenting David's manipulation tactics, his psychological abuse, his systematic isolation of me from my support system. I recorded phone calls where he criticized me. I saved text messages where he blamed me for his behavior. I kept a detailed journal of every incident, every cruel comment, every time he made me doubt my own perception of reality. The private investigator's reports came back with damning evidence that exceeded even my worst expectations. Photos of David and Jessica entering hotels together in the middle of workdays. Video footage of them kissing in restaurant parking lots. Recordings of phone conversations where they laughed about how gullible I was, how easy it had been to manipulate me, how much they were looking forward to spending my money once the divorce was finalized. The investigator also uncovered something I hadn't known to look for. David had been running this same con before, with a woman in Boston 5 years before he met me. He'd courted her, convinced her to combine finances, then disappeared with a substantial amount of her money before she could take legal action. He'd changed his name slightly, moved to Chicago, and reinvented himself with a new professional identity. Jessica had been helping him research potential targets, identifying successful women with inherited wealth who fit his victim profile. I'd been selected specifically, researched thoroughly before that supposedly chance encounter at the coffee shop. Every detail of our meeting had been engineered based on information they'd gathered from my social media, from people who knew me, from public records about my family's wealth. The forensic accountant's findings were equally devastating and equally useful for my case. He traced the movement of funds through multiple shell corporations and offshore accounts. David had been systematically draining our joint accounts for years, replacing real investments with fraudulent ones that existed only on paper. The $400,000 from my inheritance was just the tip of the iceberg. When you included the value of assets he'd hidden, property he'd purchased in Jessica's name using my money, and investments he'd liquidated without my knowledge, the total came to over 800,000. He'd even taken out loans against our house without my knowledge, forging my signature on the mortgage documents. The accountant assembled a comprehensive report showing every fraudulent transaction, every forged document, every instance of financial manipulation. This wasn't just a bad divorce. This was systematic, premeditated fraud that could result in serious criminal charges. The evidence gathering became my secret mission, the thing that got me through each day of pretending our marriage was real. I discovered that David had been having an affair with Jessica for nearly 4 years, that she was fully complicit in his financial scheme, that they'd been planning to move to California together once he'd successfully drained my assets. I found emails between David and his mother, who I'd thought adored me, where she encouraged his deception and made vile comments about me being too stupid to see what was happening. I uncovered documents showing David had been forging my signature on financial documents for years, moving money in ways that could constitute criminal fraud. I documented approximately 400,000 of my inheritance that had been secretly transferred to accounts in both his and Jessica's names. I gathered proof that David had been sabotaging my career, making anonymous complaints to my firm's ethics board, spreading rumors among clients that I was unstable and unreliable. His plan hadn't just been to divorce me and take my money. He'd been systematically working to destroy my professional reputation, so I'd have nothing left to rebuild with. Contacting my allies was the next crucial step. I reached out to Sarah and apologized for pulling away, explaining vaguely that I needed her help with something important. We met at a coffee shop far from my usual haunts, and I showed her the evidence I'd gathered. She cried when she saw how thoroughly David had deceived us all, how the man we'd welcomed into our lives was a complete fabrication. She became my co-conspirator immediately, helping me think through the confrontation I was planning. I carefully reconnected with my parents, my sister, and my close work friends, not revealing everything but bringing them back into my life in ways that seemed natural. I needed people on my side, witnesses who could contradict David's narrative about me being paranoid and unstable. I also reached out to some of David's own colleagues, people he'd mentioned having conflicts with, and through careful conversation discovered I wasn't the first person David had targeted with elaborate schemes. He had a history of manipulation and fraud that he'd successfully covered up until now. When I finally told my parents the full truth about what I'd discovered, my father's reaction was more intense than I'd expected. He blamed himself for not seeing through David's performance, for giving his blessing to our marriage, for not protecting me from this predator. My mother held my hands across her kitchen table and told me she'd had a bad feeling about David for months, but had convinced herself she was being overprotective, that she needed to trust my judgment as an adult. We spent an entire weekend together, going through every piece of evidence, planning the confrontation, making sure every detail was perfect. My father, who'd spent 40 years as a prosecutor before retiring, helped me understand exactly which evidence would be most effective in criminal proceedings versus civil court. He made calls to colleagues still working in law enforcement, ensuring that when the time came, the right people would be ready to act. My mother organized the guest list for the birthday party with military precision, making sure every person invited was someone who would either support me or whose presence would maximize David's humiliation. My sister Emily became an unexpected asset in my planning. She worked in event planning and helped me understand how to orchestrate the birthday party confrontation for maximum impact. She advised me on timing, on where to position key people in the room, on how to control the flow of information and emotion. She suggested we hire the videographer under the guise of capturing memories, but really to document evidence that could be used in legal proceedings. She helped me craft the invitation list, the seating chart, the schedule of events, all designed to create the perfect trap. Emily also did something I hadn't thought of. She reached out to David's ex-girlfriend from college, a woman named Michelle, who we'd met briefly at our wedding. Michelle had been oddly cold to David that day, and Emily wondered if there was history there. Turns out, David had cheated on Michelle throughout their 3-year relationship, had borrowed money from her that he never repaid, and had spread vicious rumors about her when she finally ended things. Michelle was more than happy to provide a written statement about David's pattern of behavior, evidence that this wasn't a one-time mistake, but a consistent character trait. Setting the trap was perhaps the most challenging part, because it required me to continue acting completely normal while knowing exactly what David was planning. My birthday was approaching, and David was being unusually attentive, helping me plan the party, suggesting we make it bigger than usual, inviting more people. Now I understood why. He wanted the biggest possible audience for my humiliation. He wanted our entire social circle, my professional colleagues, my family, everyone who mattered to me, to witness his triumphant announcement. So I played along perfectly. I acted excited about the party planning. I let him invite everyone he suggested. I agreed when he wanted to hire a professional photographer and videographer to capture the evening. I even let him convince me to give a speech during dinner, thinking I was planning to talk about how grateful I was for another year of life and love. I smiled and nodded, and pretended to be the naive wife he thought I was, while internally I was planning his complete destruction. The confrontation scene was set for Saturday, November 18th, my actual birthday, at the Four Seasons ballroom David had rented for the occasion. The setup was exactly as David had envisioned it. A beautiful space overlooking the Chicago River, decorated with white flowers and gold accents, tables arranged for 150 guests, including my entire family, David's family, colleagues from both our professional lives, friends from every era of my adult life, and strategic business contacts David wanted to impress. There was a stage with a microphone for speeches, a professional photographer moving through the crowd, and videographers capturing every moment. I wore a stunning emerald dress that David had surprised me with, not knowing I'd discovered the credit card charge was from 3 months ago, when he'd bought it for Jessica, but had her return it so he could present it to me as a birthday gift. The irony was almost beautiful. As guests arrived and mingled, drinking champagne and eating elegant hors d'oeuvres, I worked the room with genuine warmth. I hugged friends I hadn't seen in months. I laughed with colleagues. I thanked people for coming. David watched me with what I now recognized as predatory satisfaction, thinking I was giving him the perfect setup for maximum humiliation. The reveal moment came exactly as David had planned it, except nothing went the way he expected. After dinner, David stood up and tapped his champagne glass, calling for everyone's attention. The room quieted, and 150 faces turned toward the stage, where David now stood with a microphone, his expression shifting into what he probably thought was reluctant sadness. He began his prepared speech, talking about how difficult this was for him, how he'd struggled with the decision, how sometimes love wasn't enough when two people grew apart. He said he'd been wrestling with his feelings for months, that he'd tried to make our marriage work, but he'd finally accepted that we wanted different things from life. The room was completely silent, confused guests exchanging glances. My mother's face draining of color. Then David said the words he'd been building toward. He announced that he was filing for divorce, that this party would be the last time we'd be together as husband and wife. That he thought I deserved to hear it surrounded by people who loved me, and could support me through this difficult transition. The gasp from the crowd was audible, and I saw people starting to rise from their seats, outrage forming on faces throughout the room. But before anyone could react further, I stood up calmly and walked to the stage. David looked confused as I took the microphone from his hand. Then I smiled at him, a smile I'd been practicing for weeks, and said loudly enough for every person in that ballroom to hear clearly. I said that what David didn't know was that every single person in this room already knew everything. I'd told them all weeks ago. I explained that everyone here had gathered not to celebrate my birthday, but to witness David's exposure as a fraud, a con artist, and a criminal. The shocked reaction on David's face was priceless, captured perfectly by the videographer, whose real purpose David had never suspected. Then I gestured to Sarah, who was standing near the entrance, and she opened the doors. In walked Detective Morrison from the Chicago Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, along with 2 uniformed officers. I'd been working with them for 3 weeks, building a criminal case against David for fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement. David's shocked reaction was everything I'd hoped it would be and more. His face went from confused to panicked to desperately calculating as he processed what was happening. He tried to maintain his composure, started to laugh it off like it was some elaborate birthday prank, but his voice was shaking. He said I was being dramatic, that I was making a scene, that I was proving exactly what he'd said about me being unstable. But then I nodded to my attorney, who stood up and began reading charges from a legal document: forgery of my signature on financial documents, fraudulent transfer of assets, identity theft, embezzlement of marital funds, criminal conspiracy with Jessica Winters to commit fraud. Each charge was backed by evidence that had been submitted to both civil and criminal courts. David's face went white as he realized the trap had completely closed around him. He tried to leave the stage, but the police officers moved to block his path. Jessica, who'd been sitting at a table near the back trying to look invisible, stood up to run, but was stopped by security I'd hired specifically for that purpose. The authority figures who validated my story weren't just the police. I'd also invited Judge Catherine Reynolds, who'd presided over several of my cases, and who David had met at various social functions. She stood up and addressed the crowd, explaining that she'd reviewed the evidence I'd presented and found it substantial enough to warrant criminal investigation. She spoke about the seriousness of financial fraud, about how abuse isn't always physical, about how manipulation and psychological control are real forms of violence. Her words carried weight that silenced any potential sympathizers David might have had in the room. Then my forensic accountant stood up and presented a summary of his findings. Projected onto screens, David had rented to show photos of our happy marriage. Instead, everyone saw detailed charts of stolen money, forged documents, and hidden accounts. The evidence was overwhelming and impossible to deny, displayed for 150 witnesses who would never let David rewrite this narrative. The public humiliation David experienced in those moments exceeded anything he'd planned for me. His own mother stood up and started screaming at him. Not defending him, but berating him for embarrassing the family, for being stupid enough to get caught. His business colleagues were edging away from him, like he was radioactive, clearly calculating how his criminal behavior might splash back on them. Friends who'd believed his version of our marriage were staring at him with disgust as they realized how completely he'd lied to everyone. The photographer and videographer he'd hired were capturing every second of his public shaming, recording that would be used in court and that I'd make sure followed him for the rest of his life. David tried one last manipulation tactic, turning to me with tears in his eyes and saying he was sorry, that he loved me, that we could work this out. But his voice had no power anymore. Everyone in that room could see through him now. The spell was broken. The resolution came swiftly and completely. David was arrested that night, charged with multiple felonies. The criminal trial took 8 months, but the evidence was so overwhelming that he ultimately accepted a plea deal to avoid a longer sentence. He was convicted of fraud and embezzlement, sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, and ordered to pay full restitution of the 400 zloty he'd stolen, plus penalties. Jessica was charged as a co-conspirator and received 3 years. Both were required to pay substantial fines and legal fees. David's professional reputation was completely destroyed. His financial consulting business collapsed when clients discovered he'd been stealing from his own wife. He was disbarred from several professional organizations and will likely never work in finance again. The public nature of his exposure meant he couldn't quietly move to another city and start over. Everyone knew. The videographer had given me all the footage, which mysteriously found its way to several news outlets covering the story of the con artist attorney's husband. The legal proceedings revealed even more damage than I'd initially discovered. During the criminal investigation, forensic analysts found that David had been planning to drain my 401k retirement account the week after my birthday party. He'd already forged the necessary documents and was waiting for one final signature from a complicit bank employee who was also charged in the scheme. If I hadn't uncovered his plan when I did, if I'd waited even another few weeks, I would have lost not just my inheritance, but my entire retirement savings, leaving me financially devastated at 38 years old. The prosecutor told me that David's plan had been extraordinarily thorough, that he'd researched every aspect of my finances, found every vulnerability, and exploited each one with precision. This wasn't opportunistic theft. This was sophisticated, premeditated financial abuse, carried out over years with calculated patience. The trial itself became something of a media sensation in Chicago. Local news covered it extensively because of the dramatic birthday party confrontation and because I was a well-known attorney at a prominent firm. The story had everything journalists loved: betrayal, revenge, justice served publicly, a smart woman turning the tables on her abuser. David tried to paint himself as the victim, claiming I'd trapped him, that the relationship had been consensual, that I was exaggerating the fraud for revenge. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury saw the forged documents with my signature. They heard the recordings of him laughing about manipulating me. They reviewed the financial trail, showing systematic theft over years. They listened to testimony from his previous victim in Boston, from Michelle describing his pattern of behavior, from the bank employee who'd conspired with him. The verdict came back guilty on all counts, after only 3 hours of deliberation. When the judge read the sentence, David actually cried, real tears this time, realizing that his entire scheme had backfired spectacularly. Jessica's trial was equally satisfying, though she tried a different defense strategy. She claimed David had manipulated her too, that she'd been a victim of his schemes, and hadn't known the full extent of what he was doing. But prosecutors had emails she'd written strategically planning how to maximize what they could steal from me, messages where she celebrated every successful manipulation, correspondence where she researched my family's wealth and suggested ways to access it. She'd been a full and willing participant in every aspect of the fraud. Her defense crumbled quickly, and she received a sentence, only slightly shorter than David's, because she cooperated with investigators about some offshore accounts they hadn't discovered yet. Watching her get led away in handcuffs provided a sense of closure I hadn't known I needed. The financial justice was equally satisfying. In the civil proceedings, I not only recovered everything David had stolen, but was awarded additional damages for emotional distress and fraud. His hidden accounts were seized and liquidated. The prenuptial agreement he'd forged was invalidated, which meant the divorce settlement was based on actual law rather than his fabricated document. I received the house, which I immediately sold, because I never wanted to step foot in it again. I was awarded a portion of his future earnings, though those will likely be minimal given his criminal record and destroyed reputation. His mother, who'd been complicit in encouraging his scheme, was mortified to discover I'd recorded several of her phone calls with David discussing me in vile terms. And those recordings damaged her social standing in her wealthy suburban community. The complete financial accounting showed that not only did I recover everything I'd lost, but David's legal fees and restitution obligations left him essentially bankrupt. The social consequences for David extended far beyond the criminal and financial penalties. His family essentially disowned him out of embarrassment. His father released a public statement saying David's actions were unconscionable and didn't reflect their family values. His college friends stopped taking his calls. The social circle we'd shared completely rejected him, rallying around me instead. People who'd known him for decades said they felt disgusted that they'd been fooled by him, that they'd celebrated at our wedding, not knowing it was all a sham. David became a cautionary tale in Chicago social circles, the man who tried to con his wife and ended up losing everything instead. Meanwhile, I was surrounded by support and sympathy. My firm stood behind me completely, even giving me a promotion after the dust settled, saying my handling of the situation demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking and resilience they valued in their attorneys. My family closed ranks around me, providing emotional support throughout the legal proceedings. Friends I'd lost touch with reached out to apologize for not seeing what was happening sooner. My new peaceful life began emerging even before the legal proceedings concluded. I bought a beautiful condo in a different neighborhood, decorated it exactly how I wanted without considering anyone else's preferences. I reconnected with friends I'd lost during my isolation, rebuilding my support system stronger than before. I threw myself into my work with renewed energy, taking on high-profile cases I'd been avoiding because David had made me doubt my abilities. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in recovery from psychological abuse, working through the trauma of realizing my entire marriage had been a performance. I joined a support group for people who'd experienced similar manipulation, and hearing their stories helped me understand I wasn't alone or stupid or any of the things I'd been telling myself. Slowly, the shame I'd felt about being deceived transformed into something else. Pride that I'd fought back. Strength from surviving something that could have destroyed me. Clarity about who I was without David's constant manipulation, shaping my self-perception. The condo I chose was in Wicker Park, a neighborhood I'd always loved but David had dismissed as too trendy and young for us. The space had floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the rooms with natural light, exposed brick walls that gave it character, and a rooftop deck with views of the city skyline. I furnished it entirely with pieces I chose myself, colors I loved. Art that spoke to me personally rather than coordinating with some imagined aesthetic David would approve of. For the first time in years, my living space felt like mine, reflected who I actually was rather than who I was performing being. I hung photographs from trips I'd taken before meeting David, displayed books I actually wanted to read instead of impressive titles meant to signal intelligence to guests, played music I enjoyed without worrying whether David would mock my taste. The simple act of controlling my own environment became deeply healing, a constant reminder that I'd reclaimed my autonomy. Professionally, the aftermath of the trial actually enhanced my reputation rather than damaging it, as David had planned. My firm received significant positive publicity for standing by me, and I was promoted to senior partner within a year of the divorce being finalized. I began specializing in representing victims of financial fraud and domestic manipulation, using my own experience to better understand and serve clients facing similar situations. I spoke at legal conferences about recognizing psychological abuse in professional settings, about how manipulation tactics cross economic and educational boundaries, about why intelligent, successful people are often targeted precisely because they have more to lose. My practice thrived because I could offer clients not just legal expertise, but genuine understanding of what they were experiencing emotionally. I built a reputation as someone who fought aggressively for victims, while maintaining the emotional intelligence to support them through the trauma of their cases. The support group became an unexpected source of both healing and purpose. Meeting other people who'd been targeted by sophisticated con artists helped me release the shame I'd been carrying about being deceived. I heard stories from doctors, engineers, business owners, educators, all highly intelligent people who'd been manipulated by partners who saw them as marks rather than human beings. We shared strategies for recognizing red flags earlier, for protecting ourselves financially and emotionally, for rebuilding trust after betrayal. I formed genuine friendships with several people from the group, connections based on shared understanding rather than the surface level socializing I'd done with David's crowd. These were people who understood why certain behaviors triggered anxiety, who didn't judge when I admitted I still sometimes questioned my own judgment, who celebrated small victories in the recovery process alongside major milestones. The lessons I learned from this experience reshaped how I see relationships and trust. I learned that perfection is often a performance, that people who seem too good to be true usually are, that my instincts were right all along, and I should have listened to them sooner. I learned that isolation is a weapon abusers use systematically, that cutting you off from people who truly know you makes manipulation easier. I learned that trust isn't about ignoring red flags, but about believing people when they show you who they are through their actions. I learned that I'm stronger than I ever imagined, capable of surviving betrayal that would have once seemed completely unsurvivable. The healing journey continues even now, 3 years after that birthday party confrontation. Some days are harder than others. I still occasionally catch myself questioning whether something was real during our marriage, trying to separate the few genuine moments from the performance. I'm more cautious in new relationships, perhaps too cautious, still learning how to trust again without being naive. But I'm building a life that's authentically mine, not shaped by someone else's manipulation. I'm dating again, carefully, taking things slowly, being honest about my history and boundaries. I'm closer to my family than I've been in years. My career is thriving beyond what I imagined possible. I've become an advocate for others experiencing psychological abuse, speaking at events and writing articles about recognizing manipulation tactics. I've turned my worst experience into something that helps others. My message to anyone watching is simple but crucial and life-changing. If your partner isolates you from loved ones, makes you doubt your perceptions, criticizes you constantly while calling it love, keeps secrets, and gets defensive when questioned, and makes you feel crazy for having completely legitimate concerns, those are not quirks or phases. Those are systematic abuse tactics specifically designed to control. Those are systematic abuse tactics specifically designed to control and manipulate you into submission. Trust your instincts. Document everything. Build your support system. And when you're ready, fight back with every resource you have. You deserve better than someone who sees you as a mark. You deserve genuine love, real respect, and honest partnership. Thank you for watching my story. If you found this valuable, please subscribe to this channel for more real stories of survival and justice. Drop a comment telling me your thoughts, and remember that you're stronger than you know. Your past doesn't define you, but how you respond to it absolutely does. Choose to fight back. Choose to survive. Choose yourself.